welcome to Science with Armstrong. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at ecology and interrelationships between organisms. First, we're going to take a look at the levels of organization within an ecosystem. We're going to start off small and go to the big. The smallest you can get, or the least inclusive, is going to be a species. There are many definitions of what a species is. The one that we tend to use in general biology is that organisms that are so closely related that they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. Now, there are a couple of problems with this because there are asexual beings that don't need another organism of its same species in order to reproduce. They do something like binary fission or budding where they don't necessarily need a secondary organism to create that new organism. This definition doesn't work for all cases, but it's one of the most generally used. When we group a bunch of species together, it's called a population. So population is simply a bunch of the same species living together. And then when we take a bunch of different populations and put them in the same area, we're now looking at a community. And then when we take a bunch of communities, put them together, and then also include the abiotic factors or the non-living factors such as water, soil, weather, you're looking at an ecosystem. When you put a bunch of ecosystems together that are similar, you're going to get a biome. And biomes are things like the tundra, the taiga, the temperate forest as we live, temperate grasslands, chaparral, tropical rainforest, and so on. When you take all of the biomes and you put all of the biomes together, that is when you get the biosphere. The biosphere is basically planet Earth. Now let's take a look at how some of these species populations interact with each other. First, we're going to take a look at competition. Competition can be intraspecies or interspecies. If we're looking at intraspecies, we're looking at competition within the same species. And that could be competing for food, competing for mates. When we're looking at interspecies, we're looking at competition between organisms of a different species. So they're not going to be competing for mates, but they're definitely going to be competing for resources such as water, land, food, that sort of thing. A classic example of competition is with these paramecium. These paramecium, one is large, one is small. When they are grown separately, they have a very nice population growth, seen here in the top chart. When they are put together, the larger of the paramecium species does not make it and does not survive because the smaller paramecium has an advantage over the large one in that it doesn't need as much food to keep it going and therefore can make its population grow faster, and that larger paramecium species doesn't have a chance to make it. If we look at the competitive exclusion principle, the competitive exclusion principle basically states that two species competing for the same resource can't coexist in constant population, that one species is going to have a slight advantage over the other, making it tough for that other to survive. So those that have the better advantages are going to dominate and are going to take over that area. And that's going to force the other species to either go into extinction or as a population or as a species, try to find a different way to survive in that area. Maybe utilize that area just a little bit more. Here is as an example, you have these kind of two looking marshmallows, the smaller one and the larger one. And they are trying to coexist. One's growing up from the bottom, one's growing up from the top. And depending on the resources available, it's going to determine which species can actually survive a little bit better in that area. And along with competitive exclusion, we can also look at resource partitioning. So with resource partitioning, this explains what happens to that other species that doesn't quite make it in competitive exclusion. So with resource partitioning, the organisms that are competing for the same resource somehow evolve to become a little bit more specialized and utilize that resource just a little bit better and a little bit more specifically. When we're looking at competitive exclusion and resource partitioning, we're talking about how that organism interacts with their environment. So it's not just their habitat, but it's how they utilize their habitat. And that's called the niche. There are two different types of niches. You have the fundamental and then you have the realized. The fundamental niche is the textbook definition of niche. So when you're looking at that organism, what niche should they textbook be able to live in? And then when you look at real life, that's the realized. Where do these organisms actually live is their realized. And for whatever reason, they might not necessarily be able to survive in a particular spot because of competitive exclusion. There's something else, some other species that is encroaching and not allowing for that particular species to thrive in where they should be able to thrive. Along these same lines, we have predation. Predation is where one species hunts after another. So you have the predator, who's the hunter, and the prey, that's the food. That is going to be a relationship between the two organisms, and the organisms out of the prey need to, as a species, have that adaptation that will allow them to not necessarily be found as easy, so that way they can keep their population going. Some of the ways that this is done is through coloration within their species, kind of ways to hide themselves, cryptic colors. Take a look at this picture here. This is a picture of a fish. It very well blends into the bottom of the it very well blends in to the bottom of the ocean, so you can't really see it, and if you can't be seen, then you can't be eaten. Aposematic coloration is generally a warning. It's a bright flash of, hey, I'm not very good, so don't eat me. If you think of a skunk like this here, having that big bright white stripe is that aposematic coloration, just kind of a warning sign that I'm going to spray you. So that way other organisms know that not quite the best use of their time to prey on that organism. Then we have mimicry. There's two types of mimicry. There's Batesian mimicry and Müllerian mimicry. With Batesian mimicry, the edible animal is safe because it looks like the poisonous one. So here in this example, we have two snakes. We have the king snake and the coral snake. The coral snake is poisonous, but the king snake has coloration that is similar to that of the coral snake, and kind of confusing the predators of, I know that coloration is poisonous, so I don't want to take my chances and eat it. Where Müllerian mimicry, where you have several yucky organisms that all kind of look the same. If you take a look at these bees here, bees sting, and they all have this yellow and black coloration. So no matter the species and the type, you know that this organism is something that's going to cause damage. Now let's transition to relationships that involve eating. First one is herbivore. Herbivores eat plants. So they're going to be the ones that eat our producers in the food chain. They're generally the first consumer on a food chain. Then we have carnivores. Carnivores eat meat. They're going to be preying on another species. They could eat herbivores or they could eat other carnivores depending on where they are in the food chain. We also have omnivores. Omnivores are both herbivores and carnivores. They eat both meat and plant life. When you look at the digestive system of herbivores, carnivores, and omnivores, they do look different. Herbivores have a very long digestive system. Their intestines are very long. They have specialized stomachs that have different compartments for grinding and kind of digesting that cellulose. Carnivores have a very short digestive system. They don't have that specialization for breaking down the cellulose. Meat digests fairly quickly, so they don't need that long digestive system to get all the nutrient out of the meat because it happens very quickly. And omnivores, their digestive system is that somewhere in between. Us as humans are omnivores. When we look at our digestive system, we are in that in-between stage of being a little bit long enough to get some nutrition out of plants, but also much shorter than a herbivore that is solely looking at plant material. Other relationships with food, we have detritivores. And detritivores eat dead and dying things, so think like vulture eating a carcass on the side of the road. And then we have decomposers. And decomposers break down all dead matter into basically nutrient for the soil. Decomposers are mostly going to be things like fungi and bacteria. Now we're going to look at relationships between organisms. We have a mutual relationship. In a mutual relationship, both organisms are benefiting. So they're both happy. An example of this could be like bees and flowers. Bees need the pollen to feed themselves, make their honey, the nectar to make their honey. And flowers need the movement of those bees in order to reproduce. So they both benefit from this. And then we have parasitic. And in this relationship, we have one that is benefiting and one that is being harmed. So like a dog and a tick. The tick is benefiting because it's getting the food that it needs, but the dog is being harmed because it's one being bit and its blood is being taken away from it. And then also a lot of parasites tend to carry other diseases with them, and they can get other diseases. There are types of ticks that carry Lyme's disease, and so passing on the Lyme's disease to their host. Now, parasites don't necessarily want to kill their host, because if they kill the host, then they're not going to have their benefit anymore. So there is a little bit of harm in the fact that they're taking away resource from that host organism, but they don't want to kill it. And lastly, we have commensalism. Commensalism, we have one organism that is benefiting and the other organism that doesn't necessarily care. An example of this could be a whale and a barnacle, where the whale doesn't really care that the barnacles are living on its outside, but the barnacles are getting the benefit of the moving water, so that way they can get their food. And that was interactions.